All right, let's continue on. Again, some of this is going to sound very similar to what we looked at the beginning of class, but it says first the chapter will show you how to use the XML HTTP request object. And just so you know, many times when people create this object, they call it XHR. You see that a lot. In fact, in the code we're going to do tomorrow, that's what I called it, was XHR. All right. Then we go back and we talk about how to do it using fetch. As it says, HTTP request was common in the early days of Ajax, but it has some drawbacks that have led to the rise of the newer fetch. Fetch just, I think at least, is easier to use. You may agree with that. You may not agree with that. So let's go through this because I think they'd probably do a little bit better job, more thorough job than what we looked at the beginning. All right, it says to start, every Ajax request uses the open and send methods. Open opens the connection to the server for the request. As it says, the first parameter specifies whether it's a get or a post, and the second one, it gives you the URL. And you've already seen there's an optional third parameter that will say if it's true that you want it done asynchronously, and false means you want it synchronously. All right. After the open method opens the connection, as it says, the send method sends the request. All right. Again, if necessary, the first parameter can specify any data that's being sent to the server along with the request. All right. The response type property, you saw a little of this. You're going to be working with this tomorrow. All right. As it says there, it specifies the format for the data that's returned by the server. So notice there's a response type property, which has got the format for the data, and the response property, which has got the data in the format set in the response type property. So response type would be something you'd set to like application/JSON. All right. All right. The two events determine what happens when the Ajax request completes. As it says, onReady state change can be used to process the data that's returned. And typically, if you do this, you're going to have an onError event. Now, here's where it starts. You saw a little bit of this before, but the reason I want to go through this is, again, I want you to get used to callbacks. I want you to get used to promises. I want you to get used to async and await, because that's the hallmark of the rest of the class. Okay? So, as it says, to work with these events, you assign callback functions. It says it's similar to assigning an event handler. You do an event handler, you know how to do that. When you pass it, you add an event listener. So for instance, if you add an event listener to a button and you tell it to call function X, on a click event, when you click the button, function X gets called. It's the same type of an idea. Now, callback functions, as it says, are essential to asynchronous JavaScript. Yesterday, I used the term syntactic sugar with you. All right? And I said that basically when you use that, how it's basically you take something. So we talked about prototypes, and then we talked about how basically classes were built on top of prototypes. There's syntactic sugar that really, bottom line, what's still happening is the prototype stuff. It's kind of the same thing here. All right, and the promises were basically added as syntactic sugar to work over and above what happened in regular callbacks, to make it easier, and you're going to see that in just a minute. And then it still was thought that it was too hard, so that's when the async await was syntactic sugar that was added on top of promises. All right, so again, you're going to see that again as we go on. As it says, callback functions are essential to asynchronous JavaScript. That's because asynchronous code can't return a value or throw an exception the way synchronous code is. So when it's done, basically, with the callback, that signifies that it's done, so it calls what should happen next. All right? So it would be almost like, you know, the examples that I've heard back in the olden days, okay? Like when I was your age. The idea was, you know, we didn't have cell phones and the like. But when you got, you know, and you got charged for all long-distance calls. So you'd go to visit a relative that was out of state. You got home. They wanted to know you got home safe. Okay, well then after a while people started catching on to this, and they said, you know what I'll do? I'll let it ring 4 times and then I'll hang up. It's kind of what they're talking about here. It's not a call back because you're not calling them back, But the idea is now you know everything's okay, so you can go on and about your business. All right, that's kind of the way they're talking about it here. All right. So it says you must define a callback function that runs when the return value is ready or if an error occurs. Now the problem that you get with callbacks is callbacks can lead to more callbacks, can lead to more callbacks, and you literally get what they call here callback hell. In fact, I think I showed you this the other day, but in case I didn't, it's not a big site, but there is a callbackhell.com. You can go out there and they show you what can happen. All right. And like I said, it's only a page or two, so if you want to read that, if you think it'll help or whatever. So, all right. So with the example they have in here, it says the example in this figure shows you how to use an XML HTTP request object. To start with, it creates the new object. All right. Then it assigns it a string of JSON to the response type, and to specify that the response should be in a JSON format. After it sets the response type, it assigns a callback function to the onReady state change event. So it says, hey, am I at 4 yet? Which means that it's gone through successfully. And did it return 200? Which means success. So it's got to go and check that. But that could take, depending on where it has to go to check it, it could take a few milliseconds. It could take a few seconds. And, you know, in computer ease, that's a big difference. All right. So it says if it did return 4 for the ready state property and 200 for the status, it displays the JSON data in the response to the console. All right. In a more realistic application, it would do other stuff, as it says there. After assigning the first callback function, the code assigns a callback function to the onError event. Why? Because there's something different you want to do if it doesn't work. All right. So this stuff I went over before, and I did that on purpose. I just thought it would be easier to see it kind of stacked the way that they did it in W3 Schools as opposed to right here. All right. But you'll oftentimes see this. Okay. Now, when it gets to using fetch, you don't have to check the ready state. You don't have to check the status. So it's much easier because more of that stuff is being done behind the scenes. All right. It says at this point, the code for the callback function, it's set everything up, but it hasn't yet sent the request. That's what you do. All right. It says to do this, it uses the open method, eventually the send method, to finish it all up. All right. Then fetch is next, and as it says here, for new development, it's considered best practice to use this. All right. So the table that we'll see in just a minute, but we've looked at it already. One of the big differences is not using callbacks anymore. So instead of having something, and they don't really have any callback hell here on their example because it's fairly simplistic. But again, if you look at the example that I showed you here, and if I guess I can't blow that up. All right, yes I can. Always a way to do everything. Probably it'll look real skewed and out of focus, but we'll try it anyway. So when you start looking at this, all right, if this happens, all right, then you've got an else over here. But notice if this happens, it says, if there was an error, do this. Otherwise, do this. Then what's going to happen is you're going to check something else. Then you're going to check something else. Then you're going to check something else. All right, and it's called callback hell because it's like writing an if statement that's got an if statement inside of there, that's got an if statement inside of there, that's many levels deep. Because after a while, it's hard for you to figure out exactly where to put the right logic, for lack of better words. It's the same type of an idea. So what they have done to fix this, again with some syntactic sugar, is they brought in what's called a promise object. I think we talked a little bit about promises before, but I'm going to mention it again anyway. Promises are in one of 3 states. They're either pending, which means they're like in wait, all right? They've been resolved, which means whatever you tried to do worked, or they've been rejected, which means whatever you tried to do didn't work. Now, it's a little bit tricky in here because if I make a request to a server and there's a problem, I give it the wrong file name, and it gives me back a 404. Unless I test for that explicitly, it thinks it succeeded because I made a request and it gave me back an answer. All right? So those are the three things. Now they call it fulfilled. It's typically called resolved and rejected. I've never heard it called that. But pending, resolved, and rejected. All right? It says there are two more terms you need to understand when you work with promises. First, a promise that is no longer pending is considered settled. It doesn't matter, as it says, whether it worked or it didn't work, it's done. All right? Second, a promise can be resolved without being fulfilled. For example, a promise returns another promise, so the original promise was resolved. Or again, it's more or less along the lines of, I ask you to do something. You ask him to do that for you. As far as I'm concerned, you're done. You did what I asked you to do. I don't know that you asked somebody else to do your work, and I don't really care. All right. So with the example as it says in here, it says it shows how to use these methods. To start, the code passes again a URL, but it's going to be with a fetch. All right. And it says it returns a promise. So what you're going to be using in there, instead of all these ifs, are .thens. All right. And you can string up as many .thens as you want to or need to have. And then typically at the end of the last .then, you put a .catch. So if anywhere along the way something fails, it goes right to the .catch. All right? And that's what they're going to show here on the next page. Now that's pretty simple, but literally there could be scores of these .thens. You could have 50 or 60 of them if you needed to do so. It's totally legit to do that. And again, what they're saying here is for newer development, that's what they want you to do. All right? It's cleaner, for lack of better words. All right, so this is that thing I showed it to you before. So this is figure 18.6, so it's page 621. But we're going to just concentrate a little bit on a little bit of the code in just a minute that's a little bit further on in here. We'll look at the JavaScript. But again, it's a picture, it's an image or video of the day, and it gives you some more information also. But this is your first foray, so to speak, into the world of APIs. Because as it says, this application gets its data from the API that's available from NASA's APOD web service. Now, I'm going to ask you guys a question because my memory ain't that great. All right? First of all, do you remember, I think we did this at the end, you probably not for you, but for you three, of the AWD 1000 class, where we did a simple thing where we actually used an API. We built a real simple interface, and if you put in a number, it showed you stuff that was related to that number. I don't know if you remember that or you don't remember it. That actually went out to an API. And I think we went out with another example because I'm going to go back. I'm not redoing this one. I'm redoing that one because I'm trying to make it better. But the other one, did we do a thing with the dog API where you could get a drop-down list of different dog breeds? Yes, no? You don't remember that?
The first one.
But not the second one?
But no.
Okay. We're going to look at least these two things tomorrow. All right? And with everything that we do tomorrow, I'm giving you the code. But I want us to really talk and walk our way through this code. Some of it I might ask you to key in yourselves, again, just so you get an understanding of what's going on. All right. So again, on 622, that's the HTML and the CSS. There's not really a lot of HTML in here when you look at this. All right, you can see it's using jQuery, and again, some CSS, no big thing there. So this right here is the URL that they're using. All right. Now, and as it says, if you go out here to this planetary thing, it says API key missing. All right. So what that means is where it's got a pod, probably, I don't know if this is correct or not, but I have to go out to like, well, it's not there either. So I would have to go out to api.nasa.gov, and I'd have to go in there and have it generate an API key for me. All right. And hopefully this makes sense to all of you. The reason they're asking you to do that is they want to be able to track what you're doing. And I don't mean that they're looking at everything that you're doing, but they have a way once you do this that if for some reason you were able to bring down their servers, all right, they want to know who did it. All right. Years ago, I remember this, again, this is my time before your time, before there was, what, Jimmy Kimmel, Stephen Colbert, all right, there was David Letterman, and before him there was Johnny Carson, all right. And Johnny Carson, I remember, it still is relevant today. He brought a guy on one day, and he asked, he said, how many of you know what this guy does? No one did. He was a cat burglar. He was a burglar, and a good one, all right. And so what ended up happening? He got caught, got out, got caught again, got out. Well, then the cops contacted him and said, hey, would you like to come work for us? All right, and that's a lot of times too what happens, all right, is people who are able to hack into things, you don't hear about it because they end up actually hiring these people, all right? All right. As it says, this key only supports 30 requests per hour, all right? I mean, what is that? 60 minutes in an hour, that's 1 every 2 minutes, right? That's probably going to be plenty for most of us. But again, most of these typically also have a payment plan. So if you want to do more than that, if you have you want to hit an API and you have people that are going to be using your service and there's going to be millions of them, you would want the paid service. All right. So let's see. I mean, this stuff, I'm not going to go over this. Get date strength to get a string. That stuff isn't important. All right. But let's take a look at what else is in here. The code checks whether, yeah, it has a code property. Okay. Most of it, if not everything that's in here, I think everybody in here could understand. One thing I do want you to start doing, if you're not doing it now, is every time you're using variables and you're printing something out, just be using template literals. Don't be using where you got the single or double quotes and then say plus variable name. Don't do that anymore. All right. It's just everybody is doing it this way, that they're using template literals, and that's the way it's recommended that everybody do it. All right. So it says here basically what it's doing. If you remember when I ran that for you before, when I ran, where is it? This, that it's got to come in here and it's got to make sure that you're putting in a valid date. It's within range, whatever they ask that range to be. Plus, for instance, if I were to come in here and say, oh, I want the from 2020, let's say, okay, I wanted February, whoops, 30th, 2020, 2:30. It comes back in and it handled it. Well, there's two things that it can do. It can either handle it like that, and possibly what it did was that might be March 2nd.
Changed the date.
Oh, okay, March 1st. Yeah, see that? It was a leap year, so there were 29 days in there. So even though I put that in, it went ahead on the calendar. Why? Because that's much easier than giving you an error message, isn't it? But at the same time, I don't know if I were to put in here like 15-15, well, let's say 15-133. All right. Now it's saying, please enter it in this kind of a format. So what it was doing on those previous pages is it was building that date request. All right, that's what the JavaScript is doing. But notice what it says in here. After building the URL for the API, it uses the fetch to make the request. If it's successful, it says the second then that's in there will display the picture. All right? And it's also got to show you that text that goes along with it. All right, and it says the last statement moves the focus to the enter date box. So the point is the key stuff that's in here is happening in there. All right, and this is what I'm talking about. Where they say this, you would replace that with your key. Does that make sense? All right, and sometimes with these things, depending on what you're working with, for instance, next week when we work with this stuff with Google, that can be public. It's a public key. Anybody can see that. But if it's a private key, typically when you go out to the site, they'll say, do not share this with other people. All right? Now, I mean, it wouldn't be a big thing if, you know, if you shared yours with you, etc. That isn't a big thing. But leaving it out there where anybody can grab it can be a big thing because it can end up costing you money. All right. Talked a little bit before about this, how to make multiple Ajax requests. Sometimes you need more than one thing from a server. All right. It says if you need to make additional requests, all right, your response becomes more complicated. It's especially true if you're using the XML HTTP request object. In that case, as it says, you need to nest those additional calls. That's what leads to the callback help. All right. And I guess they did show an example in here. It's not a great example, but you start seeing this. And why is that a big thing? Technically, anywhere in here, this can fail. All right. So as they say, if you need to use the data from an asynchronous call to make another asynchronous call, and you're using this XML HTTP request object, you nest one callback function inside of another callback function. That's, again, what can lead to the callback hell. Now, does fetch solve the callback hell? Yes and no. I mean, yes, it does, in that it's much easier to use, but since it's basically syntactic sugar on top of callbacks, if you don't know what you're doing, you can run it, you can still run into problems with it. All right? So as it says, instead of nesting the callback, it chains promises. Every one of those .then statements that you saw before, so all these, that's generating a new promise. So that's like saying, I'm promising to do this. All right? And then if I get there, then I promise to do this. And if that works, then I promise to do this. Then I promise to do this. And again, notice in this case, there is no .catch. That can be dangerous. All right? Almost always when you are going out to a website, you want a .catch in there. The website could be down. Something in here you could have spelled something wrong. There's a lot of different things that can possibly happen. And again, why would you do that? Because typically in the .catch, you can have a message where you print out what that information is. Not only what that information is, you can print out what the status is. So you can see if it was a 400, meaning it's your fault, as opposed to a 500, which means try later, it's the server's fault. All right. You can also use named callback functions. All right. It says the code in the previous figure is more readable. However, the code in the previous figure can't be used to return values in later callback functions. So to make it easier, you still have the potential problem of callback hell, but when you're returning something, you're actually returning a value. All right. Then you can take that, as it says, you end up making what's called a promise chain. You almost never see it the first way that's shown there. It's the second way. So you're saying, do this. If that works, then do this. If that works, then do this. If that works, then do this. Type of an idea. All right? All right. So again, it says here that figure 1810 on page, it'll be 644, is going to show how to handle errors because they haven't put in a .then yet. All right, 634, not 644. All right. Now, you may remember this back from the day we've done try catches before. Remember that? You try and then you put in a bunch of code that can conceivably fail. Then you have one or more catches and they go from most specific to most general. Then if you want at the bottom, you can put in a finally. And the finally runs whether the try succeeds or the try fails. And one of the things that we said about the finally is the finally oftentimes is used for housekeeping. Close database connections, close files, etc. Same thing here. All right. So you can have a finally method that is executed regardless of whether something works or it doesn't work. All right. Plus in here, if you look at the example, they have also added the dot catch. All right. Really, the dot catch is kind of your catch-all. So if something goes wrong, and then you notice you've got a finally. All right. Now, if you don't do this, if you look at that example, this says read the file. So you're reading the file, you're displaying the contents, and let's say there was no error. All right. In fact, let's do it the other way. Let's say there was an error, and we did not put in there that finally closed file. The file would remain open. And with a lot of databases, depending on how they're set up, the database might be open, and now you've got control over it. It's not shut, so when other people come in and try to make requests, they're denied. All right, so that can be pretty dangerous. So as it says, it's a good practice to end every promise chain with a catch. All right, and the finally should be used if you know that, hey, if this doesn't work, there's no sense in going on. Usually a finally is going to be used, like I said, you try to open a database and you go through a bunch of stuff, and if someplace along the line it fails, all right, the catch, you would alert somebody that what the problem was, but the finally would then would literally go in and close the database. All right, then there's another one. I didn't look at this one, this photo viewer, so I'm not going to go through it. All right, so more skills working with promises starting on page 640. As it says, so far this chapter has shown you how to work with promise objects that fetch and then and catch. You can use promises for a lot of different things. All right, you literally can instantiate a promise object. What does that mean? Remember when we instantiated objects, how we used the new operator? You can call new and pass it a promise as an example. All right. Now there's different things that you can use with these. And you'll notice there's a couple of the methods. There is a resolve method. As it says, is the callback that's registered by the then. There's a reject method. Well, what does that mean? The resolve means that basically it worked. All right. The reject means it didn't work. But also remember, because I said this before, all right, depending on how you write this, this is telling it that it's resolved only if it's got a ready state of 4 and it's got a status of 200. If it's anything else, and typically it won't be the ready state, it'll be the status here. So if the status is anything other than 200, all right, if it is anything other than that, you reject it. Now earlier, I don't know where it is, but probably closed it now. If you remember, one of the things that I clicked on, I'm not going to go back to it, but it had in there a bunch of different things in there that explained all the codes. All I want to mention to you is there are 200 codes, which are success. The only one that they're checking for in here is 200 itself. When I say there's other 200 codes, there's other codes between 200 and 299. 200 means okay, but there's other 200 codes that are in there also. They're not checking for those. There's a couple methods. Remember, a static method means that it's called by promise itself. All right. If you decide that you want to chain a bunch of stuff together and use it kind of as a transaction or as one unit, that's like a promise.all type of thing. All right. And as it says there, if all promises are fulfilled, it returns a promise object that resolves to an array for each promise you put in there. If it's rejected, it only shows the rejected promise and nothing else. All right. There is not just an all, but an all settled. All right. Then there's erase. That's kind of a different one. If I've got this dot then dot then dot then dot then dot then, it is possible that one of these dot thens that are down there might actually finish up before an earlier one. What Ray says is as soon as any one finishes, basically say that it's been resolved. All right. Then there's the regular resolve and reject. All right. The second last thing that's in here, starting on 644, is working with async await. All right. So again, async await is the newer way of doing promises. But what you're going to find is if you ever become a JavaScript developer and you're working on existing code, you're going to find that there will be callbacks in there, regular callbacks. There'll be promises in there. All right. But the idea is, ideally at least, with new development, that new development will be done using async await. All right. It says most developers are used to synchronous code, and code that works directly with promises looks different, okay, even though it's designed to make their lives easier. Fortunately, as it says there, the async and await keywords, all right, make asynchronous code look more like synchronous code. It says when you define a function, you use the async keyword at the beginning of it. Then inside, you use the await word. All right. So as it says, the await keyword tells JavaScript to wait until the promise is settled and then return its result. But it'll only work, so if you've got await in there and you didn't put async at the beginning before the function, you're going to get an error. They work as a pair, for lack of better words. So when you look in here, here's some examples. Async, await, async, await, etc. All right. That was very quick because, again, you're going to see this stuff again and again. So again, as mentioned here, the async keyword declares an asynchronous function. The await keyword tells JavaScript to wait until the promise is settled and return its result. You can only use async and await with functions that are being written asynchronously. This brings up, there's a new kind of loop. It's a for await of loop. All right. Why that? Because it's a special loop that works with async and await. All right. So it says if you want to make multiple asynchronous requests, you can use the promise.all or the promise.settle. Sometimes, though, as they mentioned, you need to make multiple asynchronous requests and you need control over the sequence of these requests. So for that reason, you can use this for of or a for await of loop. Notice there's two of them. The for of we've looked at already. It says the main difference between the two is that the for await of includes the await keyword in the statement itself rather than in the body of the loop. So it's saying apply this to everything that's inside of the loop. So they've got an example right there. And the last thing that's in here, I'm not going to go through this updated photo viewer. We didn't go through the original photo viewer. Again, talks about cross-origin requests. And again, that is the idea. You're on one server, or you're accessing one server. Now you need to go and access another one. All right? Now, it'll be pretty easy with the stuff that we do in Node because we just add. So if you look in here, look on the screen here, and we go out to npmjs.com, you'll notice that we can search for CORS. And there is a CORS library. All right? The stuff that we use, this stuff, all the stuff that's in here, basically, as it says, it's middleware. All right? If you say, I don't know what that means, that's what, we're going to be going into that. But if you click on it, it shows. And at least at times with some of the stuff that we're going to do, all right, you'll have to be installing that. Now, I don't want to sit and read to you, so let's just jump right to the end here. All right. It says ways to make a cross-origin request to an API that doesn't allow them. Nobody uses iframes anymore. All right, they were a hack to do things you shouldn't have been able to do. JSON P the P in there stands for padding. So that's JSON with padding. That's older as well. It's recommended that you don't use that. Next is a third-party proxy. It says only recommended for prototyping and testing. Well, that leaves the last one. So if you're into something this deep, you create your own way of doing this across servers. And that's pretty much what they're saying there. All right, so finish this up. Again, for security, browsers enforce the same origin policy rather. All right, meaning that the JavaScript code from one origin can't request a resource from another origin unless that resource returns a response with the appropriate headers. So it's all the stuff that's happening behind the scenes, so to speak. All right. So if the response from an API doesn't contain the correct course headers, you can't make an Ajax request across that API. Okay? All right. To make a cross-origin request, again, as it says, you can use a server-side proxy. All right? And that's pretty much, I think, it. All right? So the only other thing that's left in this book, and we will go through this sometime mid-next week, is to do this. All right? Got done a little earlier than I thought we would today. All right? That one didn't take very long. All right, but the idea is, again, by tomorrow, anything that you're turning in to me as far as that first assignment, if you want to add to it or whatever, I want it in by tomorrow because I will be grading it over the weekend. All right, questions? All right. Again, most of the class isn't going to work like this. We're typically going to have plenty of stuff to do. All right.